we go. Good evening and welcome to the Bloody Scotland Book Club. My name is Craig Robertson and I am delighted to be your host tonight for what is the first chapter in a new venture for Bloody Scotland. First of all, thank you to all of you for signing up and joining the book club. It really wouldn't be much of a club without you. So thank you for joining and thank you for reading one or more of this month's books. This will be the format going forward. We give you 3 books to choose from. You can read 1, 2, or even all 3 of them, and we'll discuss it like this at the end of the month. This month's books, which I hope you know by now, are Laidlaw by William McIlvanney, Worst Case Scenario by Helen Fitzgerald, and Out for Blood by Deborah Masson. To discuss them, we have 4 guest reviewers with us tonight. Thank you to them for coming along. We have a journalist, a blogger, a writer, and a bookseller, which sounds like the start of a joke, but if we all walked into a bar together, we'd get arrested because sadly they are not open yet. So in turn, could you please at home give some applause to, in order, to Jane Hamilton. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Craig. How you doing?
Jane, I am very well, thank you. Jane is the crime reporter for the Daily Record and its star columnist. Welcome.
Thank you.
We also have Simon Lloyd. Simon is a bookseller at the fantastic Waterstones in Falkirk. Hi, Simon.
Hello, good evening.
Hello. We have Mary Picken. Hi, Mary.
Yeah.
Hello, Mary is a crime fiction blogger at, make sure I get this right, liveanddeadly.net.
Yep.
And last but not least, we have Zoe Venditozzi, who is a writer and hosts the Witches of Scotland podcast. How are you all?
Good, thanks. Hi.
Good.
Thanks.
Good, good. We are going to just kick straight off with our first book. What we're going to do each week is, each month rather, we have asked the authors to do a video for us, introduce themselves. Some of them are going to do a reading. Obviously, sadly, we can't do that with book number 1, which is William McIlvanney. What we will do, I'm going to read you a bit from the back of the book. I think we all know a little bit about this book, but let's do it anyway. It says, meet Jack Laidlaw, the original damaged detective. When a young woman is found brutally murdered in Glasgow Green, only Laidlaw stands a chance of finding her murderer from among the hard men, gangland villains, and self-made money men who lurk in the city's shadows. There's also a quote in the back of this book, which I quite like. It says, it's doubtful I would be a crime writer without McIlvanney, by some guy called Ian Rankin. So that says a bit about the importance of this book. What we do have for you, instead of a video with Will in it, we have a treat. We have the man himself reading from the first chapter of Laidlaw with a video to go with it. Let's watch and listen.
Everything had changed. You could walk for as long as you liked in this city. It wouldn't know you. You could call every part of it by name, but it wouldn't answer. St. George's Cross was only cars, inventing destinations for the people in them. The cars controlled the people. Sauchiehall Street was a graveyard of illuminated tombstones. Buchanan Street was like an escalator bearing strangers. George Square, you should have known it. How many times have you waited for one of the buses that ran all through the night? The square rejected you. Your past meant nothing. Even the black man on the black horse was from another country, a different time. Sir John Moore, they buried him darkly at dead of night. Who told you his name? An English teacher who was always tired. Yonner Johnson. He told you interesting things between yawns, but he hadn't told you the truth. Nobody had. This was the truth. You were a monster. How had you managed to hide from yourself for so long? Some conjuring trick to juggle smiles and nods and knives and forks and walks for the bus and turning the pages of a paper for 20 years to make your life a blur behind which what was really you could hide until it came to introduce itself. I am you. George Square was nothing to do with you. It belonged to the three boys walking tightrope on the back of a bench to the people waiting in the bus queues to go home. You could never go home again. You could only walk and be rejected by the places where you walked, except the derelict tenements. They were big darknesses, housing old griefs, terrible angers. They were prisons for the past. They welcomed ghosts. The entry was dank. The darkness was soothing. You groped through smells. The soft hurryings must be rats. There was a stairway that would have been dangerous for someone who had anything to lose. At the top, a door was broken. It could be pushed closed. Some light came in very dimly from the street. The room was very empty, some plaster from the ceiling on the floor. It was strange how little blood there was, just some dark flecks on the trousers, so that you could imagine it had never happened. But it had happened. You were here. The body had been like leprosy. You were the leper, a contamination crouched and rocking on its haunches. The loneliness was what you had made of yourself. The coldness was right. You would be alone from now on. It was what you deserved. Outside, the city hated you. Perhaps it had always excluded you. It had always been so sure of itself, so full of people who didn't open doors tentatively, who had a cocky walk. It was a hard city.
There we go. Laidlaw, one of the most iconic novels in certainly modern Scottish crime writing, which maybe opened the door for all of it. I read it first in the 1970s. I read it again on the sort of rebirth of the trilogy in 2013, and then was able to go back to it tonight. I'm guessing we'd all read it before. Would I be right? Before that?
I think I read it at school. I've got a vague memory that I read it maybe in 6th year at school.
How did it feel to you, Zoe, going back to it now?
I loved it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It's one of those books that you're just you know about. You know, if you're a reader and a writer in Scotland, I think that you've got that in your kind of your mental bookshelf. But I hadn't really thought about it too much. And then reading it there, you know, like a few weeks ago, I was just really stunned by how brilliant it is, actually. I just think it's so amazingly well written and clever, and you have to think as you're reading it. It's not a passive experience. I think you've got to keep engaging with it because it is clever. And I really loved the way that he explored the city as well as the characters, as well as the crime. I thought it was amazing, actually.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And one of the key things there, I think, is that there isn't a lot of plot to Laidlaw. A young woman has been murdered in Glasgow Green, and we learn very early, Simon coming to you, we learn very early who killed this young woman. So it's not who done it. Yeah, it takes us on such a journey from there.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminded me of The Black House by Peter May, where you're reading the book, but you're so engrossed with the characters that you're almost forgetting about the crime itself. But you're really taken into the characters and Glasgow. So I don't think I'd ever been to Glasgow until sort of mid to late 80s. So a chance to see Glasgow as it was something that really grabbed you. And reading it again, having read a lot of other authors who had obviously been influenced by him, you can see where they've picked up various points, but going back, you can see how good his writing was as well.
Yeah, I think quite a few of us have tried and failed to steal bits of McIlvanney. I think we'd probably all admit to that. Mary, coming to you, just your second time reading Laidlaw, or?
second time with pretty much a 40-year gap in between the first and the second reading.
So how did it
So-
stand up in second reading?
It actually stands up incredibly well. I was surprised by the fact that it wasn't all that dated, really. I mean, there are some obvious things like they go everywhere on buses and there aren't really mobile phones and that kind of thing. But in terms of just the whole tenor, I thought actually lots of contemporary themes there. And the prose just sings. He's such a brilliant, lyrical, but spare writer, you know, just tremendous power in the language. And as we heard in that clip that you showed, Glasgow just suffuses this novel with a life and a personality and a vibrancy of its own. It's such strength there.
There is. Jane, coming to you. Well, actually, before we ask you about it, I think in the interest of transparency, I'm going to point out that you knew Willie before, and you were in a movie with Willie. How far back are we talking now?
Early 90s.
Early 90s. Jess, do we have? There we go. There we go. It's Clark Gable, Scarlett Johansson. I don't know who the other one is. What kind of experience was that making a movie with William McIlvanney? What kind of experience was that making a movie with Willie? Fun, I'm guessing.
Lots of fun. I mean, obviously, I knew who he was. We had to read his books at school, and so of course, I was a bit overwhelmed when they said that it was going to be he was going to be my co-star. It was a bit sort of even more so than the guy who was our co-star was a very famous ballet dancer, and both Willie and I felt a bit sort of intimidated by him, given that he was the bigger name. However, he was lots of fun. He would stand and babble in French when we were trying to do scenes, very serious scenes, just to sort of put us off. I had a kissing scene and he stood there and he said, "Just imagine it's Clark Gable."
Yeah,
And
I have no idea.
that was in reference to the fact that daft old me had turned around and said to him, you remind me of Clark Gable. So he teased me mercilessly about that. Oh, it was just incredible.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And I'm guessing he didn't mind too much. What do you make of Laidlaw? Going back to it this time, what did you make of the novel?
Reading it again, I felt, obviously it's a classic and it's one of my favourite books. My gran, I've got my gran's old copy of it from the 70s. And yeah, it's a little dated in terms of, diversity in language, but he was so far ahead of his time in terms of his characters. He just took you right into the heart of, it wasn't, as you say, a whodunit. It was all about, it was character driven. And when I read it now, obviously when I read it as a youngster, the character didn't really mean that much to me, other than, he was a policeman who had a bit of a sense of humour, and he was quite, a black sense of humour, but was quite, had a big moral compass. And when I read it again recently, I just thought, I wondered if maybe bits of Willie were in there, knowing what I knew of him, that I thought maybe, that strong moral compass that Laidlaw's got, and it was intelligent and very strong. And I just thought, was he, writing a little bit of himself in that book?
I think he was writing a lot of himself in that book. There was a lot of Willie and Laidlaw, both as a philosopher. Let's talk about the character Zoe. Laidlaw is this book. Two main characters, Laidlaw and Glasgow, but concentrating on Laidlaw or does it blur the line between them? Is Laidlaw Glasgow at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, just. Oh, sorry, am I?
Well, we'll come back to you. That was for Zoe, but we'll come back to you in a minute.
I think that the character in Glasgow, I don't know, it's interesting. I moved to Glasgow when I was 17. So I went away to university and hadn't really been there much except for the months before. But coming from sort of Dundee sort of area, Glasgow obviously had this sort of the stereotype that it was a tough and mean and dark city, but that completely was not my experience when I moved there. People were really, really friendly and nice. So I've never really thought of Glasgow in those kind of real kind of tough kind of terms. But I think that the way that he described Glasgow was really interesting, like about sort of, you know, I know it wasn't immediately post-war, but there was still that really kind of harsh, manly men. You know, it definitely was not where people were talking about their feelings, or, you know, and he's quite immoral, and not immoral, but well, he kind of is immoral, Laidlaw. I don't want to give anything away in case people haven't read it yet, but there's something that he does that you're a bit like, well, that's a bit naughty, you know, and he's an interesting character from that point of view. But I think maybe we think of men in at those times as that was what men were like, you know, so I think that's of its time maybe in some ways. But I think he as a character is really interesting, the way that he's the mentor to the young policeman, and, you know, he's got his books of philosophy in his desk drawer, and he's obviously seen as this maverick, and he does his own thing, you know, and I find that all really interesting. I find that really compelling.
Yeah, Mary, although Laidlaw is a man of his time, he doesn't necessarily approve of the other men of his time. He can be quite judgmental of that. He was, as I think Jane said, ahead of his time.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a macho man's man. I mean, he can hold his own with the criminals in the city. He can stand face to face with, you know, the criminal godfathers and hold his own, but he's not much fond of his other colleagues in the police force, who he sees as just macho posturing, really. And I think, you know, Laidlaw's a philosopher, and he sees his colleagues, I think, as quite narrow-minded. And the whole philosophy of how he works is what he's trying to impart to young Harkness, who's now trailing him around and who's looking at him like he's never seen a policeman like it in his life. And he's probably right.
Yeah, and probably since. Simon, I think one of the things that Willie does what I think he does well, I'll see what you think on it, is that he is philosophical in this book, without any doubt, but it doesn't get in the way of the story. Would you go along with that?
Yes. And as you said, because the plot is fairly straightforward, it gives you a chance to sort of develop philosophical points. And I think rereading it again, I'd forgotten how central Harkness is to the story. He's basically the reader's way in to Laidlaw's world, and learning the philosophy the same way that the readers would as we progress through the book as well. Whereas with some other authors, it's always the main character who gives you the in, like they've just moved to the city or they've just done this case. But it was kind of different seeing it from Harkness's point of view as well, to learn as he goes along.
So
the
Glasgow,
the city, the pubs, for example, I thought are really well described. You know, like it's not the kind of pub that you would ever in a million years want to actually go to. I wouldn't, as a woman particularly, but I think it was really interesting the way they're described, and it's grim. It's, you know, they're not where these men are hanging out. It just seems like it's almost like a job that they're sitting in the pub in this tough way with these other tough guys. I thought that was amazing, the way that was all described, and the sort of the masculine descriptions, and the way that, you know, some of the characters don't fit in with the expectations. I thought that was quite ahead of its time. I thought that was quite interesting, looking at sort of some of the issues that he brought up in the book.
yeah, and although these are pubs you wouldn't want to go into, they were pubs of their time, and there are still pubs there, undoubtedly, you would not want to go into, and they're there. Sam, you said you didn't go into Glasgow until the 80s. Did you learn anything more about Glasgow from this? Because I think part of the reason that Laidlaw tours the city on foot and on buses is that we can see and learn about Glasgow while we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. Because because I didn't go into Glasgow until the 80s, probably because of my age, I was too young to go out there in the 70s, so I never really got a chance to see the sort of tenement Glasgow as it was. And I think that one and Denise Mina's Long Drop sort of brought that era of Glasgow to life. Obviously, with William writing it at the time, it's obviously there and then, so you get an authentic feel of Glasgow. But it's kind of weird thinking, oh yeah, I remember that place, but it's not quite how I remember it because it's all been cleaned up and changed over the years as well. So it's quite an interesting, almost a time capsule of Glasgow as it was. And as you say, I think that's the most
well, it is, and it does give us a chance to see that. Jane, if you're back with us.
I am.
Yeah, good.
Just about.
Right, so time capsule Glasgow, how did that stand up for you, looking back on that and a view of it?
My dad lived in Glasgow in the 70s, and obviously as a child, you know, when I read that book as a teenager, I had no concept. All I knew about Glasgow was that it was a different city to the east, you know, the people are friendly, but I didn't have any sort of knowledge about this darker side, you know, of life. And then you read Laidlaw and you think, oh, it was a bit bizarre because, you know, when I was there as a child, it was all, you know, very sweet parks and ice creams and, you know, nice people, completely different to the east side of the country, I have to say, you know, much more friendly and open. So it gives you a real feel for 1970s Glasgow. And for me, what stood out more so now was the poverty and the poverty and the pride that quite often goes hand in hand together. And, you know, they might have been that bleak, poor lives that they were living, but that huge sense of pride that they, you know, and that really does capture Glasgow in terms of what I see now at work, you know.
No, I think you're right, and I think one of the things at this day, you know, bringing Scottish crime fiction to a modern era, is that it was and is very much a Scottish novel. You know, it was a departure from a wild departure from the Agatha Christie novels of manor houses and well, ladies fresh from church. So I think it's part of its importance is that this is undoubtedly a Scottish novel. Is it a Scottish novel or is that a Glasgow novel? Somebody want to pick hairs in it? Split hairs?
I think it's a Glasgow novel because it's the Glasgow patter that helps to make it, frankly. You know, and nowhere else would you get a man saying, oh, well, he's been mincing their ego for years, you know. I think that's pure Glasgow. And that's what helps to mark it out.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Simon, you were going to come in there.
No, I agree completely. It's definitely a Glasgow novel because there's, once you go to certain other areas of Scotland, it's nothing at all like the Glasgow there, but you can still recognise the Glasgow of the 70s even today, but not quite as not quite as dark in some places. But
I think the dark places are still there. They're just maybe better hidden than they were in the 70s. Another thing that strikes me about this book is that Willie sometimes walks the line between the guilty and the innocent, so that he has sympathy with Tommy, who is the killer, who will learn very early on is the killer. And he has sympathy with him being a product of his environment. I think he does that well. Someone want to jump in? Zoe, how do you feel he tackled that element of sympathy with effectively the bad guy?
Yeah, it's interesting the way that the bad guy's painted, because he's done a terrible thing and it's really brutal, you know, the murder and the way that it's carried out, and it seems to be for like very brutal reasoning that's in his mind, and that's him speaking in the beginning, isn't it? In that extract that we heard, he's talking to himself. I think that's what I took anyway.
It is. Yeah.
He's a really mixed up, traumatized young man. I mean, he is only young. He is only 20 or so, isn't he, when he commits the murder?
Yeah.
And it's because he's stuck in a situation where he can't be himself, and it gets turned in on himself, I think, and then he does this terrible crime to this innocent girl who's just trying to find a lad, and she's really trapped. I think he is interesting the way that he's written, because he's not actually tremendously present then in the novel. He's hiding away, so it's everybody else's idea about him, and he's just this kind of cowering, broken shell of a human, who knows that he's crossed the line into this totally awful area. So I thought that was quite interesting. It certainly wasn't one of those crime novels where it's like, oh, and here are my dark machinations and it's revenge on this person, and it's absolutely not that kind of thing at all. He's a person that's made a terrible and foolish decision to do something awful. He's not a criminal mastermind at all. So I found that really interesting. And it wasn't really about him, really. It was about this kind of network of men around him conspiring to deal with the problem, or, in one way or another.
He makes a point of saying that it wasn't just one person that killed Jennifer Lawson. That she was killed by circumstances, rather than just looking for one killer. So that's him, I think, Simon, examining the city and all the bad things coming together to produce one terrible incident.
Mhm.
Yeah, and like the girl herself, the individual's not tremendously important, really. It's not really about her as a person. It's what she stands for, like womanhood. And that's one way in which I think that it's still pretty contemporary, the issue of, it's about male violence, and it's about her as just a body that this is perpetrated against. It's not that she's done anything. It's that she is just a female body that he is expressing his kind of anger against.
Mary, Zoe's right. Those issues are still prevalent, and it's as relevant today as it was then.
Very, very much so. And I think part of what Laidlaw is about standing up for those who are weak and who are damaged and who lack the ability to stand up for themselves. That's what makes him a moral character in a world of macho violence, really.
Suddenly, Jane, if you could unmute yourself, and we'll try and catch you while you're here.
Sorry, internet problem.
Yes, okay. So Jack Laidlaw he has some sympathy with Tommy, with the killer, because he knows that one of the great things I think about he's writing is nothing's in black and white. He knows that the city's full of shades. And I was just about to ask you that you must have come across people like that in your crime report, but we won't. What we'll do instead is we've got some questions. Everybody watching, please send us in your questions or your comments, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. I've got some here already. Marion Todd, the author, says she's amused at Laidlaw and Harkness taking the bus while inquiries, and how we've grown used to the car and fast response times by the police. Jane, it's not line of duty in terms of police flying around the place, but different times, I guess.
What was that? Is that accurate? Did the cops or the policemen or police officers go around on buses, or was that just something that he had invented?
Does anybody know the answer to that one? I think it's unlikely they're going around. I mean, we've seen them all in the pre-Z-car days. They did have cars, so.
Is it just a comment on the fact that Laidlaw is such a maverick that he was even ahead of the curve with climate change and was sticking to public transport?
I suspect so. Jane, you've got an answer to that one?
Yeah, I do actually, because a case that I was working on not that long ago from the 70s, and I managed to speak to a retired officer from that time who said that they did hop on and off buses. If a car wasn't available, they just had to, taxis weren't an option. So, and there wasn't as many cars on the road, and if all the cars were away, they would have to just hop on a bus.
Makes
so
sense.
You got that right.
No, fair enough. Well, I wouldn't imagine you'd get it wrong.
I often wonder actually if he had some cop pals that he maybe quizzed about, because some of the procedural stuff, he obviously did his homework.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody knows whether he, you know, did he spend a day with, you know, a week or a month even with cops, or was it just, you know, being observational? And, you know, I don't know. Does anybody know?
He was a journalist, wasn't he? He was a journalist, McIlvanney. Is that right?
He was a teacher and did some time. I'm sure he would have done his homework procedurally.
I'm betting he spent a lot of research in policemen's pubs.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's the way the police did their own inquiries. They'll be sitting over a pint with a copper, and that's how you get your information. Jane, I'm sure you know that's how it's done. Let us move on to, sorry, let me check if there's any questions regarding Laidlaw. And there is one. Simon's, if you can remember this, did anyone laugh out loud at the way Laidlaw described relationships between spouses? Or indeed, if anybody can remember the exact quote, then they should take it. If not, then we will just move on and we'll come back once we.
I found that the relationships were quite sad. I thought that the way they were described, they were all really unhappy marriages.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and
is that not just indicative of the 70s?
Maybe.
Or some of that.
There was one line that stuck out in my mind when, is it Ina? She's called, Jack's wife. She's reflecting on him being the knight errant of the crime squad. The only problem was you never knew whether you were the maiden or the dragon.
It's absolutely full of fantastic lines. Its place in the Scottish crime writing canon is absolutely to sell. Both what it is on its own as a book, I think we'll agree, and also what it led to going forward. And it made it all credible to do literary crime novels. All right, let's rush on. We are going to go to book number 2, which is Out for Blood by Deborah Masson. I'm going to read the blurb best I can. In fact, I just realised it's kind of dark in here, but here we go. A young man, the son of an influential businessman, is discovered dead in his central Aberdeen apartment. Hours later, a teenage girl with no identification is found hanged in a suspected suicide. As DI Eve Hunter and her team investigate the two cases, they find themselves in a tug of war between privilege and poverty, between the elite and those on the fringes of society. Let's hear Deborah talking.
Hi there, I'm Deborah Masson, author of the D.I. Eve Hunter series set in Aberdeen. I was over the moon and stunned for my debut to have been awarded the Bloody Scotland Best Scottish Crime Debut of the Year. And I'm even more chuffed that they are featuring the second in the series, Out for Blood, as part of the first Bloody Scotland reading group. To be appearing alongside two of my writing heroes in such talent is just amazing. No pressure. So I thought it'd be nice to read you an extract from the book, so here goes. McLean in one of the suits gently turned the body. Eve now had a clear view, the victim's face visible, matching the image on the work pass. After what seemed like forever, McLean stood and made his way over to them. Eve stopped the rocking she'd resumed, ready to pounce. What you got for us? McLean sighed. Expecting miracles again, I see. Initial examination shows blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The blood-spattered solid bronze statue found by the sofa supports that for sure. Killed with a single or multiple blows? Eve wanted answers. Miracles would be better. McLean's bag banged off his leg as he stood clear of the two suits. I don't think it was a blow to the head that killed him. Another wound? Eve looked over to the body again. Not exactly, McLean answered. Eve, confused as well as impatient, waited for McLean to spit out what he was trying to say. I'll need to confirm this back at the lab, but from what I can see, the head wound wasn't fatal. Maybe a little concussion, the need for a few stitches. It would have rendered him unconscious, I've no doubt about that, but he would have come round without too much damage, if someone hadn't suffocated him before he got the chance. I hope that's whet your appetite for more, and thanks for listening. Thank you.
There we go. That's our introduction to Out for Blood. Rather slightly gory introduction. Has anyone read now? Out for Blood is number 2 in the series. First book, as Deborah says, one of the Bloody Scotland debut of the year. So before we go into Out for Blood, have any of you read book 1? There we go. Zoe's read book 1.
I have.
And Mary has. Good stuff. Good stuff. Do you both feel that you have to have read book 1 before we go into Out for Blood, or can we read it as a standalone?
I think it works as a standalone. I think it's probably better if you've read the first one, because you've got more of an understanding of the relationship, I think, between the different police officers maybe, and what's driving her. But I think you can take for granted that something challenging has happened and she's suffering the effects of it. I think it still makes sense, but I don't know, maybe it's better to have Simon and Jane if it made sense to them.
Simon?
Yes, it made sense, and it made me want to go back and read the first one, which I intend to do very soon. And it's kind of interesting that there are elements from a previous case, obviously the events in the first book, that have traumatized the characters enough that it still lingers on into the next book, which I think is quite an interesting thing that's not always done. It's often, this is book 1, this is book 2, this is book 3. But as I say, it's quite an interesting development to see how the characters evolve over the course of time. But I enjoyed it as a standalone.
Well, it is that tricky thing that any of us who write series have to do, this business of exposition, of how much to tell, because if you tell too much, then your readers have read it already. Or, yeah, we know that, let's get on with it. And those who haven't need to know a bit. Mary, you'd read book 1, and I know that a lot of those watching, a lot of our book club members had to go read book 1 first, because that's just what they do. First of all, you understand the need to go and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly with this series, I think, because the team is really what's at the core of this book, and the team's relationships and how they develop, and the protagonist's own character development is born out of her guilt and pain and everything that she went through in the first book. So in order to understand her in book 2, I think it really does help if you've read book 1.
Right, but Deborah sets it out. Jane, you hadn't read book 1, but Deborah does that for us. She sets us out that Eve Hunter is working with a lot of anger and a lot of physical pain as we come into book 2, and that's part of what's driving her. Well, I think we might have lost Jane again. We have lost Jane again. There you go, bang on cue. I think it's now every time I go to ask her a question, she disappears. I'm beginning. Well, are you back?
I'm back.
There you go. Mary pointed out that a lot of this is team driven. Now, you being the crime reporter for Daily Record, you know how, I'm guessing, how police teams and MIT teams are set up. They're not, as a lot of books can tend to be driven by one person, but you'll know that they're team driven as they are here.
Craig, you're going out a wee bit. Can you say that last part again?
I'm saying you'll know that a lot of investigations, murder investigations, are team driven, rather than, as sometimes some of us are guilty of writing in crime novels, one person doing the investigating.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're talking, a whole team, and obviously in real life, the person that, leading the investigation isn't so as hands-on as they are in books, in terms of, interviewing suspects and stuff like that. That just wouldn't happen. An SIO just won't do that. There's, an SIO is the senior investigating officer, for anybody that's not aware of police speak. So when I read police procedurals, I do sometimes get a bit wry when I think that things, that's just not going to happen, which is probably why I don't watch a lot of police procedurals on the TV, because there's a lot more that goes into an investigation than what you can squeeze into an hour of drama.
Yeah.
But my only sort of bugbear with this book was, and you know how OCD I am, and I wasn't aware that there was a book number 1, so trying to get into a character was a bit difficult, because, you know, I think, as Mary said, you know, you get to know them in the first book, and then obviously in the second book, the author's following on from what's happened in the first. So I felt a bit sort of, oh, you know, I need to know what happened to her to make her the way she is.
Well, you're definitely not alone.
You were a bit naughty with that one.
Well, we felt that the first book in the series had been read by winning the prize. We wanted to go on to book number 2, but you're right, you're not alone in this. Many of the book club members have said the same thing, and we've doubled their workload because they've gone back and read book 1 in order to read book 2. So thank you for doing that. Let's talk a bit about the plot, Simon. So we have 2 bodies found within a short time of each other. We're reading a crime novel. We've got a good idea they're going to be linked, but it takes a bit of time. So tell us a bit about how the book begins.
Now, the book begins with them starting on one case, and at one point it looks as if they're not going to be able to do the other case as well, but because they have started, 2 of the members of the team have done some of the start work on the second case. They've managed to keep both of them together. And often wonder, as a crime writer yourself, how much do you put down to coincidences to have everything contained, rather than a case being completely unconnected to each other? Because that was my one slight bugbear with this one, is the fact that everything that you learnt happened to be connected to everything else eventually. But
it's a tricky thing to do because you don't want to make anything too obvious. But we learn fairly early, and I think in real life it happens that you know things will come up that bring cases together. You try and avoid coincidences and I think Deborah managed to do that. So we are looking at very much 2 different ends of the city of Aberdeen here, reflecting as the elite and I don't know, we're giving too much away, people that have been sex trafficked at the other end. And it's the counterbalance of those that really is at the heart of the book.
Yeah. So I think it's well done in getting the coincidences to work, so you're not taken out of it too much. But it's just something that I thought, oh, everything ties together in this one rather neatly. But as you say, it does balance from one end where you've got the wealthy families and the generational families there, and then, as you say, the sex traffickers, and that storyline and how they met together as well, which, without wanting to give too much away as well, is kind of well done how they've managed to combine the 2.
Yeah, and it's not an easy thing to do. It is a tricky thing to do. So it's a philosophical point, counterbalancing these 2, that wherever somewhere like Aberdeen, where we've had a lot of wealth, then we're going to see both sides of that. How did that work for you in the book?
Yeah, I think it worked quite well. I mean, the counterbalance to the wealth and the privilege were people that weren't Aberdonians as well. I mean, there were people that were brought in expressly to fulfill a function, which was, you know, to be used in the sex trade, basically. So I think, in fact, the word trade's wrong, because in this case, there's not really a trade. You know, it is trafficking. I don't want to give anything away in the book, but it's grim. Like, it is a grim sort of story, which I think is good that she's tackled that, because we know that that's an increasing issue as well in Scotland and in the UK and across Europe and probably the entire world. So the thought of that is really, really appalling. So it's interesting. I like the fact that she goes through this and the writer uncovers this, and that, you know, that they're caught, they don't get away with it, you know, and it's an interesting way that it's developed. I like that. And at the beginning, these 2 disparate bodies, you know, what's the connection? So I enjoyed that. I thought that was quite compelling.
Mary, the subject matter, there's been a few books over the last few years tackling the subject of sex trafficking as it's become more prevalent in society and maybe a bit more open. How did you feel about how it was tackled here?
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of quite interesting detail around the way that the women were, the way that the women had to live, the way that they were marked, and how their handlers behaved, if you can call them that. But for me, actually, it wasn't as grim as it should have been, believe it or not. You know, there's one point where one of the women is driven to a house which turns out to be a famous Aberdeen footballer. You know, but I rather suspect that sex trafficking isn't all about famous footballers and rich parties, however grim they are.
It's a fine line to tread, because Jane, I was going to come to you now, because we say that truth is stranger than fiction, but in this case, I suspect, you know, reality is worse than fiction in terms of just how grim it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Mary. It wasn't as grim as it could be, and having worked on trafficking stories quite a lot, in fact, more so in the last 5 years, and currently Police Scotland are running a campaign about modern slavery, and trafficking comes into that. I went on a police raid not that long ago. I can't say too much about it because it is a live case, but I was on a trafficking raid recently, and yeah, it was pretty grim, and the conditions are pretty awful. So I think, you know, she could have been a bit harder in terms of.
But there is a good writerly reason for that, though, and that is the perspective of who's telling you the story. So again, without giving too much away, there's a character who we don't get to see what her experience was, and she's the one that saw the grimness. But she's got a friend who is from the outside to an extent looking in on it. So she's giving us her perspective, which is pretty grim. And then we've got the police investigating it, and we've got the privileged people who were very much looking at it as a partying thing, and they had control. So I think if we'd had the character that you all know who I'm referring to, if she'd been telling us her story, then that would have been absolutely, she was in the room with different levels of, you know, to use the word grim again. Whereas I think the characters that Deborah Masson's written about are not privy to that in the same way. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's also the other thing that Deborah has to consider when she's writing it, it's just how much her reader wants to stomach, you know, and then because we as writers quite often get told off for being too gory. And with this, particularly the nature of this, she would have had to make a choice how much she tells and how much people really want to read. And it's a balance between that and getting over just how awful it is. We've got a couple of questions on this, or rather it's a comment from Julie Adams, who is an Aberdonian. And she's saying that it's worth noting that the outsider element in Aberdeen, now that's the trafficked people and the oil industry, took a rather parochial city, that's his Julie's words, not mine, and made it a very different place. And she says that Deborah Masson makes a really good job of putting that across. How well do any of us know Aberdeen? I don't know it all that well, I must admit.
Very well. No.
But the nature of setting is really important with novels. I know how much I like to use Glasgow, and I do very much get a sense of Aberdeen coming through in the book. Simon, if you don't know Aberdeen, do you know better now than you did?
Yeah, I think I know Aberdeen through Stuart McBride books. So,
yes.
So the fact that it's not raining all the time is a nice change. But yeah, you do get to feel a bit more of the area, despite not not having too much of a knowledge of it, that has its good places and its bad places, and the bad places can be really bad, and likewise the good places can be sort of really good and not always available to the everyday person as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that between Stuart and Deborah, the Aberdeen Tourist Board are just delighted by the way Aberdeen's represented in crowd fiction. Let us go on to book number 3, which I seem to have lost. Where are we? Here we go, book number 3. And that is Worst Case Scenario by Helen Fitzgerald. Now, I think it's fair to say that across the month, this book created more chat and more controversy than any of them. I'm going to say right up front, I absolutely love this book. I think it's fantastic. So we're going to go around and chat to everybody. Helen herself knows it's a bit of a Marmite book, or a Marmite main character. So Mary, let's come to you first. Tell us what you think of Worst Case Scenario.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Mary Shields is just an extraordinary, screamingly funny, indecent, salacious, over-the-top character who is just amazing. And I love that Helen Fitzgerald is the queen of the opening line, just unsurpassed in my view.
Oh, that's perfect, because let's hear Helen say something about Mary and about the book in her own words. Let's see her video now.
Hello everyone, I'm Helen Fitzgerald from inside my house, where I've been for a very long time, in locked down Glasgow with strategically placed undyed root hair. Anyway, I'm going to read from Worst Case Scenario, which I wrote just after I left social work about 2.5 years ago, and I already feel so out of touch, but it was an amazingly therapeutic book to write, having done that job for so long, and it's a really hard job, I think, as Mary demonstrates. I was much better at it than she is. Anyway, Worst Case Scenario. Part 1, The Wife Killer. Chapter 1. Every time Mary tried to relax in a bath, a paedophile ruined it. Tonight, it was McKinley, who she'd visited on the way home and who had sat on the sofa for 10 minutes with one or more balls hanging out of his shorts. She still wasn't sure if it was deliberate. Probably not, as Mary was 52, not 5. I'm not allowed to think about that, Mary said out loud, and McKinley's balls disappeared into the bubbles. As ever, another case invaded immediately. Not a sex offender, but a far more palatable wife killer, who she'd be meeting for the first time tomorrow. 10 years ago, Dr. Liam McDowell took his beloved wife to Loch Fyne for oysters, and on the way home drove the car off a bridge. A lot of murder-suicides seem to end this way, with one party still alive. Usually the prick whose idea it was. Mary put her head under the water and called on her victim empathy skills, imagining she was McDowell's dead wife, Bella. Liam's in the car beside me, belted in as I am. The water's rising and I'm running out of breath. Please do something, I can't get out. He's undoing his seatbelt. Why won't mine budge? I can't define the look he gives me. Is it love? Before he forces his way out of the car. Mary lifted her head out of the bathwater, took a deep breath and repeated, I must not think about that. This mantra had helped keep her sane enough. Home was precious. Work must not invade. I must not think about that. A sacred rule that was impossible to obey, and the only one she wanted to. The next morning, Mary pressed her ID against the flex machine. She was 41 hours up. If she didn't use the hours by the end of the month, which was today, they would be wiped. She wanted to smash the machine with her forehead. Instead, she ruminated as she gathered the paperwork for the prison meeting. Fucking management. Fucking job.
And I just think absolutely fascinating character whose heart is in the right place, but she's just been completely burned out by the system. You know, she tries to do her best for her clients, but it's hard when you've got very few resources. You are being bogged down by pettifogging bureaucracy. And And your managers care more about when you clock on and clock off than they do about the fact that you're screaming at them that you're really not coping as well as you might be. And on top of that, she's got the menopause. And it's playing havoc with her. And she's just at the end of her tether. And then she gets handed a case of a man she just can't bear. And it all starts to go disastrously, terribly wrong.
Yeah. Jane, if in Laidlaw there's two main characters, which is Laidlaw and Glasgow, in this one it's Mary Shields and the menopause are the two main characters. Mary Picken said that Mary Shields' heart was in the right place. I think unfortunately her mouth's in the right place as well, and she can't control that. What did you make of Mary Shields?
She was a bit Marmite. At first, when the opening line is an absolute corker, and I thought, oh, this is going to be good. But then I started to hate Mary. And then I liked her again, and I just thought she made me cringe at times. The dialogue just made me absolutely cringe. But then I thought to myself, am I Mary? I'm 40, I'm perimenopausal. Do I hate her because I see me in her coarseness, her bluntness, her humor, and she, the swearing. I swear like a sailor. So I thought, is that me? And is that why I don't like her? But absolutely hilarious character. And yeah, I agree with what Mary said there. She's her heart's in the right place, but she's just been so beaten by a system that is just red tape after red tape after red tape, and confronted by these horrible characters and people that she has to work with and she has to be nice to. But, deep down, she just wants to scream and shout and swear at them. And yeah, so no, great book. A bit sort of mixed feelings on it when it was finished, but funny.
Yeah, we can't go to the ending. I suspect we might want to talk about the ending, but that's the one thing we can't really do. Zoe, there's something about Mary. She is at the heart of this book. What did you make of her?
I enjoyed her. I work in a similar area. I'm not a social worker, but I am a teacher, and I work with let's call them disaffected young people. So I sort of get where she's coming from. I can see what that structure is like and how difficult her job actually would be. And again, like you're saying, Jane, I am 45, nearly 46. I feel the rage on a daily basis. I don't know if that's just being a woman in 2021 or maybe any time, or if it is perimenopause, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But definitely I could get what she was saying, that, the sort of the rage and the fury that she feels. And she's not taken seriously. You can see it's just building and building. It's quite a bonkers book, she just makes terrible decision after terrible decision. And I don't think it's something that you would read it thinking, I want this to be sort of hyper realistic. But I'm sure that there's a lot in it that as a social worker, you'd probably be like, yeah, I recognize that, I recognize that, I recognize that, So it is a funny book. Like it's obviously meant to be funny and disturbing in places. But I think more than anything else, I took it as a really good, a black comedy, the book, really, to be honest. So I enjoyed it. And I'm a big fan of swearing if it's real and it's in context. And she's absolutely, that's that character. Like that voice is incredibly strong. So I wasn't offended by that at all. I thought it was good. And it's interesting to have a woman character who's not likable. I think that we've got a bit of a problem with that. We want our women still to be likable. You want her to be the kind of the plucky heroine who she makes some bad decisions, but at the end you're kind of like, oh, but she's a diamond in the rough. I think the fact that she stays consistently pretty crappy is good. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I think it's a brave thing to do. Although I'm pretty sure Helen didn't think of it as a brave thing, because she didn't really care if people were going to like Mary as a character, as long as they understood why she did what she did. because some of our favorite characters we don't like, and Hannibal Lecter's always the obvious examples.
Like we're fine with male characters that we don't like, but I do think there is a gendered issue that we do prefer our female characters to have some sort of redeeming quality, whereas, you know, Hannibal Lecter's a really great example. He's a terrible character. He's a terrible man. There's nothing redeeming about him apart from his cooking. So there's nothing that you can say it's nice about him. But he's got a kind of a cherished role, doesn't he? You know, in some ways. So I think we're okay with it with guys, but with women, we're still appalled by the fact that she could be so dreadful in so many ways.
I think you're right, and it's time that was changed, and Helen's made a hell of a job and putting a character forward like that. Simon, this is the perfect time to bring you in from the male perspective on it. I'm not going to ask you for the menopausal perspective, but what did you make of Mary?
Yeah, it's weird because I'm glad I didn't pay too close attention to the quotes from the book because I didn't realise quite how funny it would be. And I think a lot of the humour comes from Mary, and it's also heartbreaking as well because you're pulling for her as well as she's making bad decision after bad decision. But as a character, she's one that gets in you. So I think I understand the menopause a bit better than I did before I started.
Well, I'll leave you to say that. I'm still trying to get to grips with it. It's hilarious. It's one of the funniest books I've read. But Mary, it's really dark as well as with the humour. And one of Helen's real tricks is putting tension and comedy side by side.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. And she slips things in. You know, I mean, she tells you just in the course of I think a major rant that Mary's on, she tells you something about Mary's background that just pulls you up short, and you didn't, you know, and then moves on. And you're kind of left thinking, oh my God, at the same time, as this woman who is at the end of her tether is also remembering that actually she would have loved it if her partner had actually gone out and got a job instead of just being a colourer in her of graphic novels. And then she could have spent some time with her family the way she wanted to. And so there are moments of pathos and then moments of completely psychotic comedy. And it just works really, really well together.
Yeah, how would we describe it? So I think one of the great things about crime fiction is it's a very broad church, whereas the first two books are detective fiction. What are we calling this? I've got a note from Louise Fairburn on the chat saying that Helen called it menopause noir, which I'm thinking is a bit of a niche market. But
menopause.
Can I just?
Yeah, Jane. On you go.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that I don't know if Helen was writing, you know, from experience, but certainly as a woman in her late 40s, you do get to that point where you feel invisible. You're not in your 20s, and you know you're not young-ish anymore. So you do start to feel invisible, and you know you do start to speak your mind, and you know be a bit more brash, a bit more open than you would have been in your 20s and 30s. And I just wonder if, you know, Helen was writing from, you know, her own experience, or I don't know whether she's, you know, been through the menopause or not, but, you know, you just wonder if certainly, you know, sometimes I feel that, you know, being perimenopausal, I'm starting to get a bit invisible, and I've got to be a bit more shouty and a bit more out there to be heard. So, yeah, I think that was she writing a bit of Mary, you know, for us menopause members, you know, I think well, I don't think of it as a crime book.
Oh, it's not like crime book, but Helen has said that all her characters are her. There's a large bit of her in all the characters, but there's a lot of Mary and Helen, and I can confirm that some of that is true, but obviously it's laid on a bit thick for a book as well. We have some comments and some questions. Louise Fairburn is, if you're looking for something less crazy from Helen, she's recommending Ash Mountain, which is set in Australia during bushfire season. Mo Macquarie is saying that she thinks most women who've been through the change can relate to Helen's book. An author friend of mine, Barbara Joyce Howlock, has said that she's just started Worst Case Scenario, and as a social worker, she's loving it, and she identifies with the burned out worker big time. Suzanne Callan says she thought that Mary had gone to the same school of charm as Stuart McBride's School of Charm. I'm sure Stuart would wear that with pride. Yeah, so what do we think? We'd recommend Worst Case Scenario. Jade, even though you maybe didn't like Helen, not like Helen, I'll take that back. You love Helen. You didn't like Mary, you still got where she was coming from.
Yeah, no, I would definitely recommend it. I mean, although Mary was a bit marmitey to me for humour and snorting with laughter moments, I would definitely, sometimes, that jaw-dropping, did she really just say that? So, yeah, no, definitely, I would 100% recommend that.
Have any of you find yourself now more likely to say things out loud that you would have kept in your head the way Mary does? Is that a trap we're going to fall into?
I think that's a battle I've had my entire life, is what it is that I think. So I just still try not to.
I think we should all try not to, but every now and again we should just give into it. We are now going to be joined, I hope, by the miracles of technology, which has obviously served us well so far tonight, by Gordon Brown, aka Morgan Cry. Gordon, hello, how are you?
Good, how's things?
Things are good, thank you very much. Now we've almost come to the end of March, basically, and March's books. So at this point, we're going to hand over the baton to you, because you are going to host the book club event for April, and you, I think, are ready to tell us what those books are going to be.
Yep. First of all, Zoe, Mary, Simon, Jane and Craig, that was brilliant. That was a great session. So I feel like I'm doing Eurovision here from the Spanish, I'd like to say. So the next club's Wednesday, the 28th of April at 7 o'clock. Our guest reviewers are going to be myself, but it'll be Jonathan Whitelaw, an author, award-winning journalist and broadcaster, Frankie Burr, ex-bookseller and host, chairperson, and organisers of book launches and events, and Louise Fairbairn, a freelance production journalist, proofreader, and was the crime fiction reviewer for the Scotsman and Scotland on Sunday newspapers for several years. So on Wednesday, the 28th of April, we have chosen 3 books. So the first of those will be Val McDermott, A Distant Echo, which is the first in the Karen Pirie series. Deals with a case 25 years, a brutal murder 25 years earlier. We're also going to do Marion Todd, who was also on the shortlist for the debut book last year at Bloody Scotland. This is our 4th book called What They Knew. It's the 4th book in the DI Inspector Claire Mackay series. And it's around about, they're not really sure if there's been a murder. It's one of those books that you have to kind of work your way through to figure if there has been or hasn't been at the beginning. And the last book we've picked is all the way from the US, which is Lou Berney's November Road, which is Lou's 4th book, but it's set against the assassination of JFK back in the early 60s and centres on a cat and mouse chase across 1960s Americas. So they are the 3 books that we'll be doing for the next book club. We'll post them up onto Facebook so everybody knows about them. And I look forward to seeing you on the 28th of April.
Yeah.
Gordon, thank you very much. Certainly, November Road's been one I've been looking forward to and meaning to read for a while. So I shall do that this month, and I'll be along with some questions for you at the end of the month. Thank you to Mary, to Simon, to Jane, and to Zoe for coming along tonight and sharing with us what I've got with 3 cracking books. Hope those of you who had a chance to read one of them have enjoyed it, and if you want to read any more, try and get them in quick before you read Gordon's books for next month. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month. Thank you.